The battlefield stretched endlessly across the horizon, a sea of metal and fire. For the human soldiers, this was the final push, the last stand against an alien empire that had waged war against them for years. The air was thick with smoke, and the deafening sounds of blaster fire filled every corner of the war-torn field. The human fleet had finally broken through the enemy's defenses, but the cost had been high. Thousands of soldiers had fallen, and the stars themselves seemed to burn with the fury of the battle. Among the soldiers stood Captain John Harris, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He had seen death countless times in the wars that had ravaged this part of the galaxy, but today felt different. Today, victory was within his reach, but so was something else, something he couldn't yet grasp. He stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching as the enemy fleet began to retreat, their massive ships turning tail and fleeing into the stars. The humans had broken through. The war was over. Captain Harris, a voice called, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his communications officer, Lieutenant Emma Jones. She was a woman of few words, but she had an unwavering loyalty that had earned her respect from everyone in the fleet. "Yes, Lieutenant." Harris turned to her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Command has issued orders," she said, her eyes reflecting the weight of what was to come. "The spoils of war are being distributed to the victors. They're bringing in the prisoners." Harris nodded. He had seen it all before. Alien soldiers captured, their lives turned upside down by their defeat. But this time, something felt different. The moment the enemy ships had surrendered, they had begun sending over their most valuable assets, the ones they considered irreplaceable, their people. He followed Emma to the command tent, where a team of officers was preparing to oversee the final stages of the operation. The alien prisoners, once proud warriors, were being brought in, their heads bowed in defeat. But among them, one stood out. A young alien woman was brought forward, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. She was unlike any of the others. Her skin was a pale blue, almost ethereal, and her delicate features seemed to glow in the dim light of the tent. She was beautiful, but there was something more, something that made Harris pause. "This one," the officer in charge of the prisoners said, pointing to the girl. "She is of royal descent. The spoils of war, Captain. Yours to command." Harris didn't know what to say. He had heard of this practice. The conquerors often took slaves from the defeated, using them as servants or trophies. But this girl was different. She wasn't like the others. There was a sense of pride in her posture, despite the chains that bound her wrists. She held her head high, as if refusing to let the humiliation of her capture defeat her entirely. The officer handed Harris a data pad with the girl's details. She was from a prestigious family, one of the higher castes of the defeated alien race. She had been trained in combat, politics, and leadership, but none of that mattered now. She was a prisoner, and her future had just been decided by the humans. Harris studied her for a moment, his mind racing. He could already hear the whispers from the other soldiers. The girl would be his prize, a mark of victory. Some would see it as a badge of honor, something to flaunt in the face of the enemy. But Harris wasn't like the others. He couldn't simply take her as a trophy. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the ground. The alien girl's eyes flickered to him for a brief moment, a mix of fear and curiosity in her gaze. But she said nothing. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't plead. She simply watched him, as if waiting for something. Harris looked at her chains, then at the officers who were waiting for his orders. The power was in his hands now. He could give the order to keep her as a slave, to treat her as nothing more than property. It was the way things had always been done. But in that moment, as he stood there looking into her eyes, something shifted inside him. "Remove her chains," Harris said, his voice low but firm. "She is not a trophy. She is a person." The officers looked at him with surprise, but they obeyed. They unlocked the chains from her wrists, and for the first time since her capture, the girl was free to move without restriction. She didn't move immediately, as if unsure of what to do next, but when her hands were finally freed, She reached up to touch her wrists, as if feeling the sensation of freedom for the first time in her life. The girl looked at Harris, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a connection that neither fully understood but both could feel. She was no longer a captive, no longer a slave to be used or discarded. "You're free now," Harris said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he meant by it. He wasn't offering her a life of luxury, not yet, but he had given her something, her dignity. Her eyes softened slightly, though there was still a wariness in them. She had been a slave for most of her life, and freedom, true freedom, was a concept that felt foreign to her. But in that moment, something shifted. She nodded once, a slight tilt of her head, as if accepting his offer of dignity, of respect. "I am not a gift," she finally spoke, her voice soft but clear, with a hint of defiance. "But I will serve." Harris was taken aback. She wasn't asking to be freed from everything. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was simply stating the truth. She had been trained to serve, and it was all she knew. But Harris also realized, in that moment, that her view of service was not the same as his people's. He could see the strength in her, the quiet resilience that told him she would never bow to anyone. She had been defeated in battle, but she had not lost herself. And that, he realized, was why she was different. She was more than a slave. She was a survivor. As the other soldiers looked on, Harris made a decision. It would not be easy, but he would not treat her like the others. He would find a way to make sure that this was not just a story of conquest, but one of mutual respect. And so, the journey began, for both of them. A human soldier and an alien girl, bound by war, but destined to redefine what it meant to be free. The days after the battle were filled with a strange calm, but the war was not truly over. For Captain John Harris, the victory felt hollow. There were still questions lingering in his mind, and one of the most pressing was about the alien girl, who had now been freed from her chains. She was unlike any prisoner he had ever encountered. The other soldiers saw her as little more than a symbol of victory, something to boast about. But Harris knew there was more to her than that. She wasn't just an alien captured in the heat of battle. There was strength in her eyes, a quiet dignity that he couldn't ignore. He had given her freedom, but he wasn't sure what to do with her now. It wasn't just the fact that she was alien. It was the realization that he had made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences. The alien girl, whose name he had learned was Lyra, had been silent since her chains were removed. She walked with the same dignity as before, her head held high, but her eyes seemed to be lost in thought, unsure of how to interact with the humans around her. She had been raised to serve, to obey, but now she was a prisoner of war, one whose future was uncertain. The soldiers watched her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. They couldn't understand why Harris had chosen to free her. To them, it was a simple matter. She was an alien, a prize to be claimed. But to Harris, it wasn't that simple. He could see the potential for something different, a chance to show mercy, to offer kindness where it was so rarely given. One evening, after the sun had set and the camp had quieted, Harris found himself alone with Lyra near the edge of the base. The stars above were clear, and the cold air carried with it a sense of stillness. He didn't know what to say, but he knew he had to say something. "Lyra," he began, his voice low, "you don't have to stay here, you know. You don't have to serve anyone if you don't want to." She didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she stared at the stars, as if they held some kind of answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet, but strong. "I don't know how to be anything else," she said softly. "I have always served. It's what I was born to do. My people, my culture, they don't allow for anything else." Harris frowned. He could hear the sadness in her voice, but also the resignation. It was a strange feeling, hearing her speak of her life as if it were a fate she had never questioned. "You don't have to follow that anymore," Harris said gently. "I'm not asking you to be my servant. I'm just giving you a choice. You're free now. You don't owe me anything." Lyra turned to look at him then. Her pale blue skin seemed to glow under the light of the stars, and for a moment, Harris was taken aback by how striking she was. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught his attention. It was the intensity in her eyes, the way they studied him as if trying to understand his motives. "I don't know what freedom means," she said, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I've never had it. I was raised to follow orders, to obey, to serve." She paused for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "But you're right. I'm not a slave anymore. I don't know how to be anything else, but I will try." Harris nodded, understanding more than he had before. Freedom was a concept that Lyra had never truly experienced. It wasn't something she could simply accept overnight, but she was willing to try, and that was enough for now. "Take your time," he said quietly. "There's no rush. You can choose your own path here." Lyra didn't respond, but Harris could tell that his words had made an impact. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of hope that had been missing before. It was small, but it was there. In the days that followed, Lyra remained largely to herself. She kept her distance from the other soldiers, who were still unsure of how to treat her. Some tried to engage with her, offering her food or water, but she only accepted what was necessary. She was polite but distant, and Harris could see that she was struggling with the new reality of her situation. It was during one of these quiet moments that Harris found himself once again speaking with her. He had come to check on her, to make sure she was all right. "I know it's hard," he said, his voice soft. "You've been through a lot, and this is all new to you, but you're not alone here." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "I don't understand why you're doing this for me," she admitted. "Why treat me with kindness when all I am is a prisoner?" Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because, despite everything, I don't want to be part of a system that treats people as less than human." She was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for what you've done, but I'll try. I will learn what it means to be free." And that, for Harris, was enough. It wasn't about repayment. It was about the possibility that, in the end, they might both learn something from each other. That in this war-torn galaxy, there was still a chance for something better, something more than conquest or destruction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days in the camp passed slowly for both Harris and Lyra. For Harris, life had become a balancing act. He had freed Lyra, but now he was unsure of what to do next. He could not simply let her wander aimlessly, nor could he force her into a role she was not ready for. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to treat her the way others would. He had started to see her not just as a prisoner or as spoils of war, but as a person who had her own thoughts, emotions, and desires. And despite her quiet demeanor, Lyra was more than just a figure to pity. She was strong, perhaps in ways Harris couldn't yet understand. Lyra, for her part, was struggling with the idea of freedom. Her entire life had been spent in servitude, and now, with no chains to bind her, she found herself lost. Every time she looked around, she saw people living their lives freely, choosing their paths, while she felt as though she was stuck in a world that was foreign to her. But she wasn't used to being free. She had always been told what to do, where to go, and how to behave. Now those rules didn't apply anymore, and it terrified her. She spent much of her time alone, in quiet corners of the camp, trying to come to terms with the changes. It was on one of those days that Harris approached her again. He had noticed the change in her, how she had been slowly becoming more withdrawn as the days wore on. He knew that something had to be done. "Lyra," he called, stepping into the small shelter where she was sitting. "How are you feeling?" She didn't look up at first, but after a moment, she responded softly. "I don't know what to do with myself." Harris nodded, sitting down across from her. "I know. It's a lot to adjust to. Lyra finally raised her eyes to meet his. I don't belong here. I was never meant to be free. Harris paused, considering her words. He could see the deep conflict in her eyes. She was torn between the life she had known and the life that had been thrust upon her. Maybe it's not about belonging, Harris said gently. Maybe it's about learning to live differently. You don't have to do what you did before. You can be someone else. You can choose what you want to do with your life. Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable. But I don't know how to choose. Captain Harris, Darnell greeted him, his voice a mix of authority and annoyance. We need to talk about your decisions regarding the alien. Harris straightened, his instincts telling him that this conversation would not be easy. What about her, sir? Darnell's gaze narrowed, and he gestured toward a chair. Harris sat, waiting for the commander to continue. We've had complaints from several of your men, Darnell began, his tone now more serious. They're questioning your leadership, and frankly, so am I. You're allowing a prisoner to walk around freely, without any supervision. You're treating her as if she's just another soldier on this base. Do you understand what this means? Harris clenched his jaw, but kept his voice steady. Lyra is no longer a prisoner. She's free, just like any of us. Darnell's eyes flashed with anger. That's where you're wrong, Harris. She's an alien, an enemy. She doesn't get the same rights as the men under my command. You can't afford to show weakness, especially not now. We've won the battle, but the war isn't over. There are others out there, other races, who will see this as a sign that we can be defeated. They'll see your mercy as a crack in our armor. Harris' heart raced, but he refused to let his emotions show. He had expected resistance, but hearing it so plainly from his superior made it all the more difficult. Still, he knew what he had to do. He would not let anyone turn Lyra back into a slave, not even his own people. I understand your concerns, sir, Harris said, his voice firm. But I won't treat her like the others. She's been through enough. Darnell's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Harris. You're creating a division in your ranks. You're letting your personal feelings cloud your judgment. I won't allow this to continue. If you can't get her in line, I'll have no choice but to take further action. Harris stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger rising inside him, but he kept his voice calm. With all due respect, sir, I won't go back on my word. I've given her freedom, and I intend to honor that. If you want to take action, you'll have to do it without my support. There was a long silence between them. For a moment, Harris thought that Darnell might dismiss him or even relieve him of his command. But instead, the commander's expression softened slightly. You're a good soldier, Harris, Darnell said after a beat. But you need to understand that this is bigger than one person. The fate of the galaxy is at stake. You need to remember who you're fighting for. Harris nodded, though his resolve had not wavered. I know what I'm fighting for. But I won't betray my own values, sir, not for anyone. Darnell's face darkened again, and he gave a sharp nod. We'll see if you can hold on to those values when the time comes. Harris turned to leave, but just before he reached the door, Darnell called out to him. Captain, he said, his voice colder now. I hope you're ready for what's coming. This isn't over. As Harris walked back to his quarters, the weight of the conversation hung heavy in his mind. He had known that taking a stand for Lyra would create problems, but he hadn't expected the resistance to come from within his own ranks. Darnell's words echoed in his head. This is bigger than one person. But Harris wasn't sure if that was true anymore. His duty to his men was important, but so was his duty to Lyra. The next few days were filled with tension. The soldiers who once respected Harris began to question his decisions. Some became openly hostile, while others stayed quiet, unsure of where they stood. The camp had divided into two factions: those who supported the captain's choices, and those who thought he was a fool for treating an enemy prisoner like an equal. Lyra, for her part, had noticed the growing hostility. She could feel the eyes of the soldiers on her, and the whispers behind her back. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't understand what. One evening, as the camp settled into a quiet lull, Lyra approached Harris as he sat by a fire, staring into the flames. She had been avoiding him lately, sensing the change in the atmosphere. But now, she couldn't stay away. She needed to understand what was happening. "Captain Harris," she said softly, "what's going on? Why do they look at me like that?" Harris sighed, turning his gaze to her. He had hoped to protect her from this, but the truth was unavoidable. "There are some who don't agree with how I've treated you," he said quietly. "They think I'm weak for showing mercy." Lyra's expression softened, and she sat beside him. "I never wanted to cause trouble," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know how to be anything else." Harris looked at her, his heart heavy. "You're more than just a soldier's prize, Lyra. You're a person with your own future, and no one can take that from you." But deep down, Harris knew that the real battle was just beginning. It wouldn't be easy to convince the others that he was right, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength to fight both the war and his own people. The camp would soon be tested, and so would his bond with Lyra. The tension in the camp had reached its breaking point. Every day felt heavier, the weight of the soldiers' discontent growing with each passing hour. Captain Harris could feel it, the eyes that followed him wherever he went, the whispers behind his back. He had always prided himself on his ability to lead, but now it seemed as though the very men he had fought beside for so long were beginning to turn against him. Lyra, too, felt the change. The soldiers' hostile stares made her uneasy, and she could sense the shift in the air every time she entered the camp. She had come to trust Harris, but the situation was becoming more dangerous by the day. Her presence, her very existence, was causing a fracture between the soldiers, and she feared that soon someone would make a move against her. Harris had hoped that time would ease the tension, but it was only getting worse. The words from Commander Darnell still echoed in his mind. "If you can't get her in line, I'll have no choice but to take further action." The threat hung over him like a shadow. He had always respected Darnell, but now that respect was tested. The whispers grew louder, and one night, as Harris sat alone in his quarters, the decision became clear. It wasn't just about the soldiers anymore. It was about Lyra's safety. Harris couldn't let her stay in a camp where the men were no longer loyal to him, let alone to her. The danger was real, and he couldn't afford to wait for things to get worse. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Harris found Lyra sitting by the campfire, as she often did, staring out into the distance. She had become quieter in recent days, as though she too had felt the growing unease in the camp. When Harris approached, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Captain," she said softly, "what's going to happen to me? To us?" Harris took a deep breath. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but he had no other choice. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low. "The situation here is too dangerous. If we stay, it's only a matter of time before they take action." Lyra's eyes widened with shock. "Leave? But where will we go?" "We'll figure it out," Harris replied, the determination in his voice clear. "I won't let anything happen to you." Lyra stood up, still uncertain, but the quiet resolve in Harris' voice gave her a sense of comfort. She had never had anyone fight for her like this, and though the path ahead was uncertain, she trusted him. "Do you have a plan?" she asked. Harris nodded. "I do. I've been thinking about it. We'll slip out under the cover of night, make our way through the forest, and find a way off this planet. I'll get us a ship, no matter what it takes." Lyra didn't say anything at first. She only nodded, as if absorbing the weight of his words. There was no turning back now. That night, as the camp settled into its usual rhythm, Harris and Lyra made their move. Harris had already prepared a bag with supplies, food, water, and a few essentials they might need for the journey ahead. The night was dark, the shadows deep, providing them with the cover they needed to slip past the sentries without being noticed. They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the edges of the camp, and avoiding the main pathways. The sound of the wind rustling in the trees covered their footsteps as they made their way toward the edge of the forest. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, not just from the physical exertion, but from the fear of what might happen if they were caught. As they reached the edge of the camp, Harris stopped and looked around. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The camp was quiet, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They had to move quickly. "We're almost there," Harris whispered. "Just stay close." Lyra nodded, her breath shallow but steady. For the first time since her capture, she felt a sense of freedom, a feeling she had never known before. But she also felt fear. The future was uncertain, and they didn't know what awaited them beyond the camp. They pressed on, weaving through the trees and staying low to the ground. The night was their ally, but time was not. Every minute they spent outside the camp increased the chances of discovery. Harris knew they had to make it to the edge of the forest before dawn. Once the sun rose, they would be visible, and the sold ears would be looking for them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the clearing at the edge of the forest. In the distance, through the thick trees, Harris spotted the small transport ship he had secured. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them off the planet and away from the danger that was closing in on them. Harris gestured for Lyra to follow him, and they sprinted toward the ship. Their breath came in ragged gasps, but they didn't stop. Not until they reached the ship and climbed aboard. Harris quickly started the engine, his hands moving with practiced ease. Lyra sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly on her lap, unsure of what would happen next. The engines hummed to life, and the ship slowly lifted off the ground. Harris glanced over at Lyra, who was staring out of the small window, watching as the camp and the planet slowly disappeared beneath them. "We're free," he said softly. Lyra didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on the view outside. But then she turned to him, her face softening with something that looked like gratitude. And perhaps something more. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Harris smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. They weren't out of danger yet, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time, they had a chance to escape, to find a new life, away from the war, and the people who would never understand. As the ship soared into the dark sky, Harris couldn't help but wonder what awaited them. But one thing was clear, they were no longer bound by the past. The future was theirs to shape, and for the first time, they were truly free. The journey had only just begun, but already, Harris could feel the weight of their decision. He and Lyra were no longer bound by the rules of the military camp, but the unknown lay ahead, and with it came both excitement and fear. They had escaped the camp, but the galaxy was vast, and survival was never guaranteed. The ship they had stolen was small, only meant for short travel, and Harris knew it wouldn't take them far. They needed a plan. As they traveled through space, the quiet hum of the ship was a constant reminder of their escape. For the first few hours, neither of them spoke much. Lyra sat by the window, gazing out into the stars, while Harris concentrated on piloting the ship, keeping them on course. Despite the calm, Harris could feel the uncertainty creeping in. They were no longer soldiers with a mission. They were fugitives, alone in the vastness of space. Lyra's presence beside him, however, brought a sense of quiet comfort. He could tell that she was beginning to adjust to this new way of life, but her silence was more than just a reflection of her nature. She was still processing everything. Her life had been turned upside down, and though she was free, she didn't yet know what freedom meant. Harris knew they couldn't stay in the ship forever. They would need supplies, a place to rest, and perhaps a chance to lay low for a while. As the hours passed, he began to scan nearby systems, looking for a potential place to land, a neutral zone where they could blend in and not attract attention. It wasn't long before he found a small, uncharted planet on their route. It was a quiet world, far from any major trade routes or military outposts. It was the perfect place to lay low, at least for a while. Harris set the ship on a course for the planet, hoping it would offer the peace and safety they needed. When they landed, the world around them seemed almost untouched by the chaos of war. The air was clean, the land lush with forests and rolling hills. It was a stark contrast to the bleakness of the galaxy they had left behind. Harris didn't know what to expect, but he felt a sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, he could breathe freely. Lyra stepped off the ship first, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the unfamiliar landscape. "It's beautiful here," she said, her voice soft with awe. Harris nodded, looking around. "It is, but we need to be careful. We don't know who else might be here." As they explored the area around the ship, Harris kept a sharp eye out for any signs of danger. The last thing they needed was to stumble into trouble. But after a few hours, they found nothing but peaceful scenery. No signs of civilization, no evidence of other travelers. It was as if they had stumbled onto an untouched world. That night, they camped near the ship. They made a small fire and sat around it, eating the rations they had brought with them. The silence between them was comfortable now, a reflection of the growing bond between them. Despite the uncertain future, there was a sense of calm here, in this quiet corner of the galaxy. As they sat by the fire, a voice suddenly broke the silence. "You're not from around here, are you?" Harris stood up quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm at his waist. But before he could react, a figure stepped into the firelight. It was a man, wearing a long cloak that obscured most of his features. He looked human, but something about him felt different, almost otherworldly. His presence was calm, but there was a strength in him that didn't need to be announced. "I'm not here to harm you," the man said, his voice steady. "I could have attacked by now if that was my intention." Harris slowly lowered his hand from his weapon, his curiosity piqued. "Who are you?" The man gave a small smile, stepping closer to the fire. "Names are irrelevant here," he said. "I'm just someone who watches over this planet. I know who you are, and I know why you're here." Lyra took a step back, instinctively wary of the stranger, but Harris stayed calm, his mind racing with questions. "How do you know us? What do you mean, you know why we're here?" The man's smile faded slightly, his gaze growing more serious. "You've escaped from the war, from the systems that destroyed your lives. You're not the first to come here. Many have sought refuge on this planet, running from their pasts." Harris frowned. "So, you've helped others?" The man nodded. "Yes, but I don't just help anyone. I help those who are willing to change, to leave behind the violence and the control they once lived under. It's not an easy life, but it's a chance for something better." Lyra looked up at him, her expression cautious but intrigued. "And what do you want in return?" The man's gaze softened, his voice growing gentler. "Nothing. I'm not here to make deals. I'm here to guide those who need it. But be warned, this place is not as simple as it seems. The galaxy is full of eyes, and they are always watching. If you stay, you must truly leave behind everything that came before. The old world will find you again if you let it." Harris exchanged a look with Lyra. This was the choice they had to make: stay and start anew, or risk being hunted down by the very forces they had escaped. Harris felt a deep sense of unease, but he also felt a growing sense of hope. This man, this mysterious figure, was offering them something they hadn't had in so long: a chance to truly live, away from the war and the suffering that had followed them. "We'll stay," Harris said, his voice firm. "We want to build something different, a new life." The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected their answer. "Then you will need to learn. You will need to adapt to the ways of this world, and you will need to accept that change comes with its own cost. But if you're ready to do that, you'll find what you're looking for." As the man turned to leave, Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation rising within him. This was a new beginning. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. Lyra turned to Harris, her expression softening. "Do you think we can really leave it all behind?" Harris smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "I don't know, but we'll try. Together." And for the first time, Harris felt a sense of peace, knowing that the future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. The days on the uncharted planet passed quietly, but the sense of peace they had initially found was slowly beginning to fade. The quiet life they had hoped to build started to feel like a fragile illusion. Harris and Lyra were settling into their new life, but each day brought a new challenge, a reminder that nothing could truly escape the past. The galaxy was vast, but the shadows of their former lives were still out there, waiting. Harris spent most of his time in the small settlement, learning the ways of the planet and becoming more familiar with its residents. It was a place untouched by war, where people lived in peace, but it was also a place where change was not easily embraced. Every day, Harris found himself helping those who sought refuge in the same way they had, running from something, seeking a new beginning. Lyra, on the other hand, had begun to explore her own path. She had been quiet at first, unsure of how to integrate into a world that was so different from everything she had known. But slowly, she began to open up. She started learning new skills, interacting with the people around her, and understanding what it truly meant to live freely. The weight of her past still lingered, but she was starting to realize that she didn't have to be defined by it. Despite the growing sense of belonging, there was always that nagging feeling, the knowledge that the universe didn't forget, and that realization hit hard when a new arrival came to the planet. It happened on a quiet afternoon, while Harris and Lyra were taking a walk through the dense woods near their home. The sky was clear, and the air was crisp, the kind of day where everything felt right. But just as they reached the edge of the forest, a sharp, loud noise shattered the calm. A loud roar of engines, and the sudden, unmistakable sound of a ship landing nearby. Harris immediately tensed, instinctively reaching for his weapon. He turned to Lyra, his voice low but urgent. "Stay here. Don't move." Lyra looked at him, her eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" "I don't know," Harris replied, "but I have a bad feeling about this." He moved toward the sound, staying hidden in the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. Lyra remained where she was, watching him, but not moving. She trusted him, more than anyone ever before, and she hoped that he was wrong. But deep down, she knew that this moment was coming. The past was never far behind. As Harris approached the clearing where the ship had landed, he could see a group of figures emerging from it. They were heavily armed, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. They moved with military precision, scanning the area around them. Harris ducked low, careful to stay out of sight. He had seen enough to know that these were no ordinary travelers. They were soldiers, and they weren't here for peace. His heart sank. The war was back, and it had followed them. He retreated, making his way back to Lyra as quietly as possible. His mind raced. If they were here, it could only mean one thing. They had found them. The past was back to claim what it thought it owned. When Harris reached Lyra, she could see the tension in his posture. His face was pale, his brow furrowed with concern. "They're here," he said quietly. "The military. They must have tracked us somehow." Lyra's face went pale. "What do we do? What if they come for us?" Harris took a deep breath, trying to think quickly. "We can't stay here. We need to leave now." They didn't have much time. Harris quickly grabbed the essentials: food, water, and a few weapons. They couldn't afford to wait and hope the soldiers would go away. Harris knew that if they stayed, it wouldn't just be their lives at risk. It would be everyone else on this planet as well. "We have to leave the planet," Harris said, his voice firm. "I know it's not what we wanted, but it's the only choice we have now." Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm with you." They hurried to the small ship that had brought them to the planet, their footsteps quick but quiet, their hearts racing. As they made their way to the vessel, Harris's mind worked quickly, formulating a plan. He knew they couldn't escape easily, not with the soldiers on their trail. They would need a distraction, something to throw them off the scent. Once they were inside the ship, Harris worked quickly, preparing the engines for takeoff. Lyra sat at the controls, her hands shaking slightly, but her resolve unshaken. "Ready?" Harris asked, looking over at her. Lyra met his gaze, her voice steady. "Ready." The ship hummed to life, and they lifted off, the ground of the planet fading beneath them. Harris glanced out the small window as they ascended, watching as the soldiers below looked up in alarm. He could hear the sounds of their weapons, the rush of their voices, but it was too late. They were already in the air. For a moment, there was silence. The ship drifted higher, breaking free from the atmosphere and into the vastness of space. Harris looked over at Lyra, who was staring out the window, her face a mix of relief and worry. The escape had been successful, but the real fight was still ahead. Harris sat beside her, his mind focused on their next move. "Where do we go now?" Lyra asked softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Harris looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "We have to find a